As we mark 100 years of the Irish Army Equitation School, this series honours the riding officers and personnel whose services and achievements define its legacy. My role in this series was to speak to those who played a key part in that history, to better understand the experiences and motivations behind their careers. These conversations reflect how their influence extended well beyond the arena, informing coaching systems, influencing breeding policy, inspiring future generations, and promoting the Irish horse internationally. This episode is part of that centenary story. You grew up near Rathdowney in County Laois, and I think what's quite interesting in your case versus some of the other people that have gone through the equitation school and had very impressive careers is that aside from riding around bareback on horses on the farm at home, you didn't really ride prior to joining the equitation school. So could you talk me through how do you find yourself going from the farm in Rathdowney in County Laois with no immediate involvement in the horse world outside of what was typical of a farm at the time, to then going through the cadetship and finding yourself in the equitation school here at McKee Barracks?
Well, that's all due to the system that they had in the army at that time of recruiting riders for the equitation school. And that system has changed a number of times since and before. But for the few years of my time, the system was when the newly commissioned class of cadets were commissioned, they all went to the equitation school for a 3-month course, equitation school here in Dublin. And that's how I was commissioned in 1957, and 21 of us, and we all came to Dublin and spent 3 months in the equitation school.
So there was no choice?
You could probably opt out of it, I'm sure.
Okay.
Although nobody did, everybody looked forward to the 3 months. And obviously we weren't at war or anything in those days, so they could afford the luxury of giving us the 3 months. And at the end of the 3 months, there were two or three in my class that had ridden ponies, and so they were full of enthusiasm for this. But it was the furthest thing from my mind that I would wind up in the equitation school. But after the 3 months, they must have seen some kind of talent, and they gave me the option of staying on for a further 6 months, which I did. And then that's the beginning of the story. I stayed here for 40 years. I never left. Yeah.
What did that initial process look like?
Well, first of all, we did a groom's course. We were based in Clancy Barracks. We were bussed up here to McKee every morning, and we groomed the horses and fed them and watered them, and then we rode under instruction for 3 or 4 hours every day. During the course of that 3 months, some people got enthusiastic about it, others tried not to bother coming, so they tried to dodge it. But by and large, it was well appreciated by everybody and enjoyed,
Did you find the process, even when you were coming to do your cadetship, even before you got as far as McKee Barracks here, did you find the process daunting or challenging, or did you enjoy it for the most part?
You mean the process of horses or the army?
The army, going through the...
In those days, there wasn't that many options, or we didn't see that. When I did my leaving cert, I had no intention, I had no vision as to what I wanted to do.
Okay.
But coming from a farming background, agriculture I was interested in. I went to an agricultural college in Ballyhaise in County Cavan for a short while. Of course, meanwhile, after doing my leaving cert, I'd done the usual exams for the bank and call to training and a couple of other things, and the cadetship. But while I was a few months in Ballyhaise, and my mother phoned me to say that she got a letter from the Department of Defence saying that I'd been accepted as a cadet. I just about knew what it meant, so I left Ballyhaise and joined the cadet school in the Curragh.
And had you applied for it yourself, or had your parents signed you up?
Oh, I had applied for
it. I
had applied for it. But strangely, I had applied for it, but strangely, I noticed since on my file that when the letter arrived at my house saying that I said, my mother wrote the acceptance letter. And that's on my file. I only saw it recently.
So there was no choice. You were accepted.
She accepted my army life from me.
How quickly, once you were in that process, we'll call it when they were training you here in McKee, or trying to decide if you were one of the if you were going to be one of the cadets that was going to be kept on here. How soon into that process did you start to see that there was a future in this for you? Because to go from really no formal riding experience to that is quite a transition.
No, it emerged fairly quickly. I liked it. I liked the riding the horses, and I liked the horses, and it appealed to me. I didn't think too much about long term, to be honest with you.
Okay.
But I enjoyed being in Dublin. We had been in the Curragh for 2 years. I enjoyed being in Dublin and a bit of social life, and very pleasant riding horses every day. So it gradually developed to a stage where I became very enthusiastic about, making the grade.
Something that I read, and I wondered how quickly that this had emerged, that you had a natural kind of inclination or a natural talent for what you were doing, because they weren't just going to keep you on because you were enthusiastic.
Oh no.
You had to make the grade. And there was a quote from one of your classmates at the time that Ned stood out from the first day of the course at McKee, and we knew he was something special. And that's from General Paddy Nolan, one of your classmates at the time.
Yeah, Paddy was a classmate of mine, and Wexford man and a friend. And maybe it was obvious to him. I wasn't any more than the fact I knew I liked it. And I suppose on a daily basis, by competition with the others, it probably became obvious to somebody that had some bit of talent that maybe everybody didn't have. I was lucky enough to be, in my build, I kind of suited horse riding as well. I was light and not too small and not too tall, So there were a few things going for me. And then the enthusiasm and the interest gradually increased.
Who were the people at that time that, I guess, shaped or molded you most, or kind of gave you those early chances?
It was interesting, really. I was lucky to meet all of the people who had been the original founders of the equitation school. The commanding officer in the school at that time was Colonel Fred Ahern. He was ill, though. He was pretty well confined to a house, so I didn't see him too often. But every now and then he came to have a look at us. Colonel Dan Corrie, Lieutenant Colonel, he was second in command of the school, and he was the main man who taught us, and he was in charge of our instruction on a daily basis. And between him and a number of NCOs, you picked up what was necessary, what was required.
Okay.
Gradually got a feel for the whole thing.
In an interview recently, you made reference to Colonel Rodzenko. Just for those that maybe haven't heard you talk about him, who was he? If you give us a little bit of an insight into his experience, but also what he did for the school here, what his impact was, and I guess how that spilled through to Irish show jumping effectively.
Yeah, I'll go back a little bit to the foundation. As I said, the school was founded in 1926 at the behest of Judge Wiley, who was president of the RDS, and they recruited the new riders. They had no horses or no army, no riders in the army. So they went out and they recruited riders who had been probably in the War of Independence, maybe the Civil War, and they got a number of them together, Harty and Corrie and Dwyer and Ahern, and all these people would have ridden to hounds and maybe were riding point to points in the meantime. So they brought him into the Army Equitation School, and that was to be our future show jumping team. But they knew nothing about show jumping. And for a year or two, they weren't making a great job of it.
Okay.
They were used to horses galloping in open spaces and hunting and whatever. But they called it stadium jumping, this new concept. So they were in Olympia in 1928, I think. And at that stage, it was being considered that this thing wasn't going to work. And they bumped into Colonel Joe Hume Dudgeon, who had been a colonel in the British Army. And he introduced him to a gentleman called Rodzenko, Paul Rodzenko, who himself had been a colonel in the household cavalry of the Tsar of Russia. Mm-hmm. But of course, with the Russian Revolution, he was now an emigre, living in London, running a riding school, I think.
Okay.
So they roped him in and brought him to Ireland, and he was the new trainer. His job was to beat these guys into shape and show a successful team.
Do you know, was there a specific reason why he was the one that was sought after to do the job?
Well, I don't know, other than the fact that he was introduced by Colonel Dudgeon, who himself was an expert and was a very successful rider. Okay. But Rodzenko had come from the tradition of the Eastern European armies, where they had these riding establishments like Tortequento and Peñarola. They were legendary establishments in those days. And there was great wisdom and scientific approach to the art of riding. So, as you would know, all equestrian sports emanated from the military. So that was, Rodzenko was a nominee. He had been successful in his own right in Russia before the revolution.
What do you think were the main things that he implemented or changed here?
I would say to be control of the horse. Like there would be nothing that Dan Corrie or the rest of them wouldn't have known about horses galloping and riding, jumping, hunting, and point to points and that. But to have the specific control of horses that's necessary for jumping fences, show jumping is another business, and it calls for a lot of hard work, correcting and improving the way the rider sat on the horse. And that I heard them, they used to talk about, they spent hours and hours and hours sitting in the saddle with Colonel Rodzenko, instructing them and probably shouting at them to some extent. And anyway, beat them into shape. And it didn't come easy. They heard some of them, there was a little bit of torture involved.
Okay. Yeah. Were there other, say in your earlier years, were there other outside influences that were brought in that had an impact during your time?
You mean in my life? Or
in your time here at the equitation school, were there other outside influences like that were brought in at particular moments?
Or you're in the show jumping world?
Yeah, when you were riding here in your earlier years at the equitation school, like that, where that someone is identified externally to come in to...
Well, in the army, not necessarily, but obviously the founding fathers of the army, for example, they were very wise people. They brought in a lot of expertise, like the School of Music. They had Colonel Fritz Brasley, and as well as that, then on a regular basis, they sent officers abroad to England and to America. So they were very careful about setting up a solid base of expertise in the early days of the army in all fields.
Okay, so people were being consciously upskilled.
Absolutely, yeah.
Externally, the other way, I suppose.
That's right.
Which was probably more sustainable, sending people out to train them to bring them back in.
Yes, yeah.
What seems to have been a common theme throughout your life from school days is the idea or the concept of leadership. And I'm not sure if it's something that you've given much thought to, because in your school days, you led the hurling team, you captained the hurling team. In the Curragh, you captained the hurling team. You captained the Kildare
hurling team. 1957, yeah.
Even throughout your roles beyond your riding career, you've literally led the nation as a chef to keep. You've been chef de mission the World Equestrian Games in Kentucky. Do you think that there was something from your early days that kind of instilled the qualities of leadership in you? Because I don't think that can be a coincidence that from the time you're a teenager right through your life, you've ended up in leadership roles.
I guess all that sprang from my father. I would say my family upbringing. We had a small farm, and there's a concept of, we didn't have any money, but the concept of working hard and not putting too much emphasis on money. There's a question of doing the job and doing it well, and to the degree that you did that, that was it, your success. And that's all I ever did. I never thought too much about leadership, but I would have applied myself to anything that I did or was asked to do. Yeah. So that's as near as I could get to.
Yeah.
I don't know about all the leadership to speak of.
I just thought it was interesting. When you look from the outside in at someone's life, and you see
to something that I was never conscious of, or to never part of my ambition to lead anything. Just to do what I felt was worth doing and do it well. That to me is sufficient leadership. If people are wise enough or foolish enough to follow you.
Because I think sometimes the most effective leaders are the ones who don't want to lead, like who don't choose to lead, because often the people who are going out to be the leaders are doing it for the wrong reasons.
I'm sure you're right there. I have plenty of experience of that as well.
Yeah. Before finding yourself in those leadership roles, as I've discussed, as chef de keep, for example, or leading the Equestrian Federation of Ireland, things like that, obviously you had enjoyed an incredibly successful international career, Nations Cups and championships, and I suppose achieving the pinnacle of what most sports people want to achieve is getting to represent your country at an Olympic Games.
Yeah.
Can you talk me through what that experience was like, right from the moment where you're selected, you're a representative, but also then for the times what that entailed actually getting to the Olympic Games, because things were not as simple as they are now.
It's never simple, but other than to say what I said about it and doing what you want to do as well as you can, I think everything else follows, and anything that came to me came through that aspect. I never had any real ambition as such. I never said I'd love to be at the Olympic Games, but for sure when I saw the opportunity approaching, and then I would have worked hard to get there. But going back a year or 2 years or anything like that, I'd never thought about it like that, including being chef de keep and even looking back on my career. If you ask me what did I get most enjoyment out of, any particular victory or win, I couldn't think of anything. It's all just a question of, for me, trying to do the thing right. And I got as much pleasure out of seeing others like a John Ledingham. And when I was chef de keep, seeing the teams doing well. But I'm kind of confused about this question of ambition in the sense of objectives.
It's incredible.
Everybody says you should set objectives, but I don't set objectives. I just do it, what I can.
It's amazing as a sports person to have achieved so much internationally without the ambition to have achieved it.
Yeah, well, in reality, see, I probably didn't achieve it internationally. I wouldn't be regarded as the winningest rider, for example. I rode 5 different horses in the Aga Khan Cup. All of them started from scratch.
Yeah.
And my claim to fame would be to do that, rather than looking back and seeing that I won the Aga Khan Cup.
Rather than having won a Grand Prix,
exactly,
you got more out of representing Ireland at home.
Absolutely, yeah. Oh, absolutely. Well, the Aga Khan Cup was the highlight for us. That's what we felt was our job, and our objective was to win the Aga Khan Cup. We didn't win it too many times, mind you, but to get there and to represent the country well, you always felt you were an ambassador for the country as well, and that had its own constraints.
Talk me through that Olympic experience, though, because I'd love to hear what it was like at the time to get there, to compete, and to be a part of the whole, I suppose, Olympic experience and celebration.
The Olympic experience, it's a huge thing in, I suppose, anybody's life. And eventually I got to 5 Olympic Games, but only one actually to compete. And that was Mexico in 1968. And it was a very memorable thing because we were there for 6 weeks in Mexico, and it gave us the opportunity to fraternize a little bit with what was going on in Mexico and the city, and there was a lot of activity indoors. There were student rights and a lot of excitement, and met a lot of people from other teams, and gave us 6 weeks, gave us an opportunity to make friendships. And there were people like Kevin Bacon in the Australian team, and a legend in his own time.
Talk me through some of those trips to, like the North American trips that I've heard various people refer to, because they seemed like an incredible experience and opportunity for many of the army riders. And because as well as the opportunity to go to those iconic shows and venues, I think what's also quite interesting is the regard that you as riders and you as Irish teams were held in. So can you talk me through some of your favorite trips, your favorite North American trips and experiences? Yes,
well, the North American trip stood out as a very special opportunity. This happened on an annual basis. We went to America for 7 weeks. We attended the shows at Harrisburg, New York, Washington, and Toronto. And it was very exciting, great social aspect to the thing. The path had been well laid for us by the people that had been there earlier, the likes of Corrie and Dwyer. They were household names in America at that stage. So it just shows you the impact that they had. So we were we were welcomed with open arms as a result of what these people had done ahead of us. And it made the whole thing very pleasant, and we were treated like royalty. Met very famous people like the Kennedys and all sorts of names that came to light later on.
Yeah, because that was my understanding of the time, was that you literally were treated like celebrities.
Absolutely.
And the caliber of people that you would have been exposed to from politicians and ambassadors and celebrities.
Yes, there was a general president of the show in Pennsylvania, in Harrisburg, and I remember him talking with Colonel Ringrose about the American Civil War and the fighting '69. And he brought us to visit on the battlefields around that area for American Civil War. Things like that. Just a lot of things that transcend the normal interests of short jumping. Remember, we went one day to visit a local stud farm, and a famous horse that later became the most famous sire in the world, Northern Dancer. We saw a Northern Dancer. We stayed with the people who owned the stud farm where Northern Dancer, I think it's about 1964 or that. So things like that were of huge interest outside the norms. And then all the different people we met. The Olympic Games in Mexico, remember one day coming face to face with Jesse Owens. He wasn't competing, but he was walking with a blazer and coming towards us. And those kind of things. I met Muhammad Ali twice, shook his hand. Also, I remember riding into Madison Square Garden one day, and some guy grabbed my leg and told me we should be at home getting the Brits out of Ireland instead of this.
So you got both sides of the welcome.
Wasn't all sunshine.
On that US tour, Was there a particular show that you really looked forward to?
I suppose Madison Square Garden would have been the big one. That would have been being Madison Square Garden, and it was a spectacular performance. It just started night time, and then everybody was dressed in evening dress. All this, it was a great ceremonial about the whole thing, and the people were very hospitable, very nice. So it was quite a very unusual and pleasant opportunity.
Because that's, having only read about it, it seems like it was such a huge fixture in a social calendar there.
Yes, amazing. So a gentleman called Whitney Stone, he was the president of the New York show, and then there was the USET, United States Equestrian Team, based in Gladstone, and all that was in the process of building up and becoming more popular around those times. Yeah.
And it's one thing that to consider you as riders being held in such a high regard, but it's also amazing to think that when you arrived with your teams and your grooms, how they were received as well. Could you just touch on that a little bit?
Above all.
About how your grooms were received on those
how
tours.
About us, my first time there would have been 1961, I think. But at that stage, our travelling head man was a guy called Walter Smith. At the time, he was a sergeant major, and he was in charge of he would have travelled with the horses for 3 weeks on the boat to get there. So once we would arrive, I remember well, there would be a queue of guys, maybe South Americans or some Americans, coming to ask him for assistance and to give him demonstrations about platting a horse or grooming a horse properly. He was a legend by then. And then following on from there were people like Steve Hickey, who was the next sergeant major, and NCOs and private soldiers, enthusiastic grooms who regarded this as a labour of love. They were notorious for their dedication to their job. And recognised by foreigners as well.
That's what's impressive in those times. Now, the power of social media, you have a top groom one place, they can have a big following all over the world.
Yes.
But in those times, the fact that, we call it your background teams, were so well received is quite impressive, and speaks volumes of the whole system here.
Yes, indeed. I kind of had thinking a lot about them. They were very special people. I remember we set up in the 60s, we set up a detachment in the Curragh to look after cadets who were earmarked for the cadets. And when that was established, I remember our sergeant major here, Steve Hickey, voluntarily, of his own free volition, you cycled to the Curragh on a Saturday afternoon just to see things were going all right. That kind of dedication.
Yeah, it went far beyond a job.
Far beyond, yeah. And there were times, I'm sure, when things mightn't have been going too well. There would always have been a certain amount of, not animosity, but rivalry between officers and because they were all competing against each other all the time. So you can imagine the allocation of horses and all of that would have been fairly critical job. So I would say that the NCOs at that time, the likes of Hickey and Walt Smith, would have played a great part in keeping the whole thing together.
Peacekeepers in all sense.
Yeah.
A role that you have been involved in the equitation school here for a considerable length of time is around the purchase board.
Oh, yes.
And I think from the outside looking in, that's something quite interesting and something I'd like to know more about, because it shows you here somebody has sold a horse to the army and things, but there's a process and there's a panel. And could you explain how and when did you first get involved in that? And could you talk a little bit about how that process works?
Yeah, probably like everything else, that has changed over the years. In the early days when I arrived here, there was a purchase board that they had been in existence since the foundation of the school. So they had their own views about horses. So they'd travel around the country and they'd find horses and they'd bring a test pilot like me or some of the other riders. So, and they'd make the deal and buy the horse. In the early days, in those days, they would buy horses that hadn't jumped at all, you know, or maybe just barely, would have never competed, but would have just been broken and riding. So that was a system, and there was a board constituted, always a civilian on the board from the Department of Defence.
Okay.
And the commanding officer of the school would be a member of it, and then a riding officer would be as I say, the test pilot. So that would have been the system mostly. Then in later times, around the 70s, we began to earmark horses and tried to buy horses who had more experience and who had pretty well established themselves at some level and were still showing potential. So that was a different process. So that would be, for example, how Rock Barton came on board. And that's it. The department or the government made funding available to step the thing up and buy more expensive horses and more proven horses. My involvement would be, I have been nominated as a member of that board as this outside agent since I left the army.
Yes.
So I've been involved in every horse that was bought for the last 30 years, I suppose.
In advance of doing today's interviews,
Yes.
I was speaking with one or two people, and one person in particular that would have come through the school here had just given me his perspective, and it's Captain David O'Brien. And he was referring to, I suppose, your involvement in the purchasing board.
All right.
And just what he had to say was his depth of knowledge in horses, both viewing them and in hand, and conformation, and how that related to how the horses travelled and what their prospects were like in the sport, that it always amazed him, like how you viewed a horse and what your views of that horse meant. Both through your career and through the purchasing board, I guess you've been exposed to a lot of top horses.
Yes.
When you're involved in that decision-making capacity, aside from the obvious price, because there's a set budget, when you're selecting a horse, what are the things that you're really looking for? And are there things in a horse that you really, really don't like that'll put you off going forward with the horse, aside from agreement on price?
Well, nowadays the system is such that by the time I get to see him and do the dealing and the end of it, they have been pretty well viewed by the riders in the school. So all that work is pretty well done, except for the final assessment and making the deal. So it's a question then of buying them as cheaply as you can. And everybody being satisfied that this has potential, you know. But it already, nowadays, all the horses that come in have shown some potential.
Yes.
But we have to be in mind, of course, that the next one, they have to reach international standard, or from our perspective, they're failure, because we have no facility for disposing of them other than old age.
From the length of your tenure, though, and your involvement in it, and even from Captain O'Brien's comments, and I think even it's no coincidence then that I believe you have a son in the US who's a very successful pinhooker. I think there might be an element of modesty here, where I think you obviously do have a strong ability to pick a horse.
Yes, well, the process of picking it is what I have. The main thing is to be confident in what you're doing. For example, I've been going out to Kentucky for the last 30 years when my son would be buying pinhook and foals.
Yeah.
Now, for years, a foal to me, all foals look the same. But after 30 years now, I would know a little bit more. So it comes from experience. And going back to the show jumping days, you have plenty of opportunity to gain experience by riding bad ones, by riding ones that somebody else bought and they shouldn't have bought. And so it's an accumulation of some kind of wisdom over time.
In terms of boards, I know it's not a one-person decision with the purchases, but in your time with that purchasing board, have you purchases that stand out as your proudest purchases?
I would think very early days, I wasn't in charge of it at the time. I did Kilbaha for
John
Lettingham. Remember a funny incident. We bought the horses. The horses are named by the minister. That's his prerogative to name the horse. And there was a gentleman here, who was the Minister for Defence, and he brought with him another politician from the Midlands. And we bought 2 horses. And sometime later it came to naming them. And both of them were named after the townland of the 2 ministers.
Okay.
And both went on to win in Hickstead, Kilbaha and a little chestnut horse.
Castle Pollard.
He was Donny Cassidy's, that he called after Donny Cassidy, and the other fellow was So all those things create a little bit of extra interest and enthusiasm and a lot of joy. And the concept of locality, a bit like the GA, to the degree that you can keep it close to its base, the whole thing, and supporting our local, our national breeders.
Yes.
That's great. There's a great source of enjoyment in that when it goes on.
And that is the thing that if, obviously when any of us as breeders sell a horse, really we don't know where that horse is going to go beyond the person we sell it to, what even country it's going to end up in. That's the one thing with the equitation school here, that you sell it because there is no resale.
Yes, you know it forever.
You're buying it long term. You're not buying it as a tradie commercial prospect to flip. Yeah. If you're deciding to buy it, it's that it's good enough as a long-term prospect, but it's going to stay within the country, and if it's good enough, it's going to represent Ireland.
And you.
Full stop. But I suppose for those less familiar with how the equitation school here acquire horses, will you just briefly touch on what the other options are in terms of how horses find their way to McKee here?
Oh, well, the leasing, like again, I think, well, I didn't quite initiate it, but I gave it a good boost when I was in the latter days of my duties here as commanding officer. We got this concept of leasing horses that for one reason or another mightn't have been for sale.
Yes.
Or the horse or an animal that comes to mind was Mill Street Ruby, in particular, for Noel C. Duggan, and obviously a mare with tremendous talent, and Noel probably didn't need to sell him and sell her.
Yes. And
we could see that she could do a job here, which she did, very good job with Jerry Mullins, I think was a lovely mare. That system, it's a very productive system from everybody's perspective, to the degree that, it works.
Throughout your international career, what are the horses that kind of surprised you the most? Maybe that you struggled with in the beginning, but then you found the key to?
I had 2 horses that stand out in my, like one was Gary Owen. She cost £2,500. And the other was Leitrim.
Yeah.
He cost £6,000. And I remember both of them very fondly. The mare in particular, she was very careful, in no way aggressive. And I mean that in the kind of almost to a degree of negative. She was always a little bit behind the bit. You could never afford to change to it, so you had to be very quiet and coax her along. And kind of the fact that she must have had some little flaw in her was manifest. Eventually, she dropped dead at 12 years of age after jumping numerous clear rounds and Nations Cups up to that. So that was a serious, sad ending, and it kind of finished my career as well, because there was no replacement. I did get a ride on Rock Barton, but he had a little bit problem with his back at the time.
Okay.
So then I was on horse, and the next 3 years they won the Aga Khan Cup, 3 years in a row. I was in Saumur in France at the time with the Cadre Noir. So that was a little bit of a shock to the system for me, because I regarded myself as only beginning to learn at that stage. Yeah. But that was again the nature of the Army Equitation School. It was about the concept of continuity took precedence over being a star.
Yeah.
And that was necessary for the survival of the school. You know?
Did you find that transition difficult?
Yeah, I have to say I did. Yeah, I was less than enthusiastic about my life for a while after that. Yeah, but eventually it all worked out pretty well. Colonel Bill Ringrose retired a few years earlier than he need have, which enabled me to take over as commanding officer.
Yes.
Meanwhile, I had been chef de keep for a number of years.
In between, okay.
And I also had time to do some instruction. I went to Australia and South America with coaching in those times, and I enjoyed that as well. So, all in all, I don't regret my life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What is it about the coaching side, or even when you've taken up those roles as a chef, like what is it that draws you to those roles, or that you've particularly enjoyed?
The coaching, being chef is an extraordinary thing. It depends very much. In the army time, when it was an all-army team, it was very simple. You were the boss in every sense.
Yes.
At a later stage, when you're dealing with Eddie Mackin and Paul Dara, they're not waiting for you to tell them what to do. And they don't always agree with what you do tell them to do. So it gets a little bit scary or hairy. So it calls for a little bit of diplomacy and an acknowledgement that they own the horses. But the good part of it is that I'm still independent, and I don't have any boss other than to get the thing done right.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's another interesting interlude in my life. Yeah.
What have been some of the most interesting coaching experiences that you've had?
Well, that would have been outside the country. In Ireland, I did quite a bit around the country, not that much. But in Peru especially, and in Australia, I coached the Australian Olympic team down there on 2 different occasions. And found that very interesting, you know, people that, you know, it's very difficult with people who are established riders. Where do you start coaching them?
Yeah.
Because most of them don't need you anyway, or don't want you. And the coaching, it's a and then if you get people at a lower level, they're not quite, they want to be jumping all the time, or leaping maybe. They're not sufficiently interested in the ground, the basic ground, because it's not exciting. So it can be frustrating for that reason.
Yes. How did you end up in Peru? How did that come about?
Oh, somebody contacted me, the Equestrian Federation down there, a fellow called Manuel Ugarte, and we made great friends. I spent a couple of months down there, brought a Peruvian team to the Pan American Games in Argentina, Buenos Aires once, and another time down to Chile, Villa del Mar. So I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed that. They're lovely, lovely people, yeah. And some good horses. So that I enjoyed immensely, yeah.
In your role as a chef,
yeah,
is there a day that stands out to you as most enjoyable in terms of a particular result that you achieved with the team, or got everyone to pull in the one direction, all the various personalities?
Well, I can tell you, I think it was 1969, we're in Aachen, and the Nations Cup was on Friday. The Grand Prix was on Saturday. And 2 riders didn't want to jump their best horse. in the Nations Cup.
Okay.
So I had the pleasure of insisting, and we won the Nations Cup next day. Things like that come to mind as doing something worthwhile that worked out well. I think they did all right in the Grand Prix as well, as far as I remember.
Okay.
But it stands out in my experience.
In terms of the civilian riders that you would have had to work with, were there any that particularly stood out as making your role a joy, or that you particularly liked how they approached things?
Yeah, all in all, it was pleasurable. All in all, it was pleasurable, and it was pretty successful. At times, there would have been, very seldom, somebody who had his own view as to where he should ride in the sequence of first, second, third, and fourth on the team. Little things like that.
Okay.
But by and large, in my role as coach, it was kind of non-existent, other than making the entries and being diplomatic.
Okay.
These guys that I spoke, they were never dependent on me to tell them what to do exactly, you know.
These are people at the top of their game.
Sure, yeah. And that called for its own level of understanding that that's the way it had to be, and they were entitled to that, and called for a bit of diplomacy now and then.
Okay. How did it come to be that you ended up as Secretary General of the Equestrian Federation of Ireland? Because again, that's a new role and a new set of responsibilities. Yeah, well,
1998, I think you probably will recall it. The Equestrian Federation here had taken on the running of the World Equestrian Games, I think.
Okay.
And for one reason or another, it fell out of bed. It didn't happen.
Okay.
I was at European Championships. I think it was the World Equestrian Games. Anyway, it didn't happen. And as a result, there was a bit of discontent in general.
Okay.
And Michael Stone had been Secretary General of the Equestrian Federation, and I think he went off to Switzerland to the headquarters of the International Federation. And he had been Secretary General of the Federation.
Okay.
So it was vacant, and I was available. So I think it was Lord Lowry in Northern Ireland that contacted me, and I took on the job, free gratis, because I just felt there might be an opportunity to do something to bring groups together. Yeah, so we made some progress in the areas there for a while. That was enjoyable, challenging. I'm glad I did it. It gave me an opportunity to do something. I was only 60 years of age, so I did that for 4 or 5 years.
Yeah.
Eventually I got paid some.
Because something, and I don't know, was this always the case, or is it something that has happened in more recent decades, but army riders being involved in kind of many more roles within the industry, from different committees, boards, chairing things, and taking up various different positions. Was that a conscious effort by the school to become more involved, or did that just happen organically?
Yeah, it just happened because I suppose, number one, they'd have to accept they were knowledgeable about the sport.
Yes.
Number two, they were independent.
Yeah.
Nobody owned them.
Yeah.
It would be a natural thing, I think, for them to get involved in the administration. They would have had all been trained as managers to whatever degree in their lives in the army, with the military courses they would have done. They'd have had a good idea about how to run offices, whatever.
Okay.
So I think it happens across the board, not just in the equestrian world. The number of army officers that went out to civilian life and would be quite acceptable, and it wouldn't be too difficult to improve their salaries. And I think right across the board, I think they would. And I think it's a pity that we hadn't more of a tradition in that line, like in England, where so many people had been in the army for a while now. The number of people outside who have had, at the moment in Ireland, who have had military experience other than at these kind of jobs. For example, in the political world, we don't have any. So I think that's a loss. I think the military training, I'm a fan. Jim Gavin, the Dublin footballer, for example.
Yeah.
Typical example of what I'm talking about. It's something to offer and doesn't want too much in return. He sees it as a natural thing to do.
As you mentioned, there are a number of people that have passed through the school here that have gone on to civilian life and had successful careers in different aspects of the industry around the world.
Yeah.
What do you think it is about the training here that kind of sets people up so well for all aspects of life, whether you're in or out of the army?
I think the basic military training, I'd be a big fan of the 2 years in the military college. You get a good feeling of what life's about, interaction with people, man management. You're not an expert in economics or anything else, but I think that's a natural thing that is developed in the training of an army officer. And then, if he doesn't get paid enough, or if he's not at war, he's available to do something in civilian life. Yeah. So that makes probably the answer to why they do well.
For those that are still within the school and will continue to be going forward, are there areas of the industry that you would like to see them involved in more roles or responsibilities within the industry?
Yeah, I think they have a contribution to make always within the industry. And I think the biggest flaw in the industry, as I see it, despite the fact that we have probably today maybe damn near the best show jumping team in the world, there's a huge lack of togetherness within the sport horse industry in Ireland. Yeah. And I think that the army officers have something to offer there in the sense of the whole concept is in the army is togetherness and team effort. It's not individual, it's not oriented towards individual endeavour. And they're all making contribution in different spheres.
What life lessons did your time in horses and in the army, what life lessons have stuck with you throughout the remainder of your life? How has it shaped your life outside of McKee Barracks?
It has given me plenty of time to think about what life's about.
Okay. And if you come up with any good answers?
The meaning of enough is the most important thing. To know what's enough. Mm-hmm. No necessity to be continually striving and setting goals for what? Not necessary. That's my concept in life, and it's worked for me.
What I try to end each interview with is to get some advice for the younger generations that are coming through. So for any young aspiring rider that might be listening to this, that would like a career in the horse industry, what piece of advice would you offer to them?
I suppose just to apply yourself diligently to whatever is in front of you with a view to maximizing your potential. Then it comes.